Indeed, I did have a relationship with Ms. Lewinsky that was not appropriate. In fact, it was wrong. It constituted a critical lapse in judgment and a personal failure on my part.
Do you remember Bill Clinton? The man who once seemed unstoppable. A president so charming he could talk his way out of almost anything. But there was one story he could never talk his way out of. A story involving a young intern, a blue dress, a secret set of tapes, and a lie told directly to the American people on national television. What started as a quiet rumor in a Washington newsroom would grow into one of the most explosive scandals in modern political history, one that would put a sitting president on trial in the Senate and change the way the world looked at the office forever. Stick around, because the details of what really happened behind those closed doors are far stranger and far more human than most people remember. The rise of a political star. Before any of the scandal, before the headlines and the hearings, there was simply a young governor from Arkansas who seemed to have something special about him. Bill Clinton was born William Jefferson Blythe III in Hope, Arkansas in 1946, and he grew up in a household that was far from glamorous. His father died in a car accident before he was born, and his mother later remarried a man named Roger Clinton, whose surname Bill eventually took as his own. It was not an easy childhood. There was hardship at home, and by many accounts a difficult relationship with his stepfather. But Clinton pushed through it with a kind of relentless charm and intelligence that would define the rest of his life. He went on to study at Georgetown University, then earned a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, and later attended Yale Law School, where he met a sharp, ambitious young woman named Hillary Rodham. The two married in 1975, and together they built a political partnership that would carry them from the governor's mansion in Little Rock all the way to the White House. Clinton became the governor of Arkansas in 1978, making him one of the youngest governors in the country at the time. He lost his re-election bid 2 years later, but came back stronger, winning the office again in 1982 and holding it for most of the following decade. Those years in Arkansas politics shaped him into the kind of campaigner few people had seen before. Someone who could stand in a small-town diner and make every person in the room feel like he genuinely wanted to hear their story. Friends and biographers alike have described him as someone with an almost photographic memory for names and faces, someone who could recall a conversation with a stranger years later in perfect detail. It was this warmth, this seemingly bottomless well of personal charisma, that made him such an effective politician, and it would later become one of the very things that made his personal failings feel so jarring to the public that had come to admire him. Long before Monica Lewinsky's name ever entered the national conversation, Clinton and his wife were already tangled in another controversy involving a failed real estate venture back in Arkansas known as Whitewater. That investigation, which began quietly in the early years of his presidency, would eventually expand far beyond its original scope, pulling in a special prosecutor who would spend years digging through the Clintons' financial and personal history, looking for any sign of wrongdoing. At the time, few people could have guessed that this obscure land deal investigation would eventually become the vehicle that exposed an entirely different and far more personal scandal. By the early 1990s, Clinton had built a reputation as a moderate, forward-thinking Democrat, someone who could bridge divides and speak to ordinary Americans in a way that felt personal and relatable. In 1992, he ran for president against incumbent George H.W. Bush, campaigning on the economy with the now famous internal slogan, "It's the economy." He won that election decisively, becoming the 42nd President of the United States and, at just 46 years old, one of the youngest men to ever hold the office. There was a genuine sense of optimism surrounding his presidency in those early years, a feeling that a new generation had finally arrived in Washington. For millions of Americans watching at the time, Clinton represented something of a generational shift, a president who could talk about music and pop culture as easily as he could discuss foreign policy, someone who felt closer in spirit to the baby boomer generation coming of age than to the older, more reserved figures who had occupied the office before him. His first term brought a mix of political wins and setbacks, from early struggles over healthcare reform to eventual economic growth that would come to define much of his presidency in the public memory. By the time he won re-election in 1996, defeating Republican challenger Bob Dole, Clinton appeared to be entering the later years of his presidency as one of the more popular and successful leaders of his era. But even before he reached the White House, whispers about Clinton's personal life had followed him. Rumors of infidelity trailed his political career for years, and one woman in particular, Jennifer Flowers, had already gone public with claims of a long affair with Clinton during his time as governor. He denied the most serious allegations at the time, and the controversy, while damaging, did not stop his march to the presidency. It seemed for a while that Clinton had a unique ability to weather storms that would have sunk other politicians. What nobody could have predicted was that a young, unpaid intern who arrived at the White House in the summer of 1995 would eventually become the center of a storm he could not weather at all. The intern who walked into history. Her name was Monica Lewinsky, and in the summer of 1995, she was 21 years old, fresh out of college, and thrilled beyond words to land a coveted unpaid internship in the White House. She had grown up in Beverly Hills, California, in a comfortable and educated family, and after graduating from Lewis and Clark College in Oregon, she made her way to Washington, hoping to build a career in public service. Getting an internship inside the White House was already a remarkable achievement for someone so young, and Lewinsky was placed in the office of the Chief of Staff, working under Leon Panetta. At the time, the government had just gone through a shutdown, and with fewer paid staffers available to cover certain shifts, interns like Lewinsky were suddenly given far more access and responsibility than they normally would have had. It was during this period, amid empty hallways and skeleton staffing, that Lewinsky first crossed paths with President Clinton. What began as brief, friendly interactions in the corridors of the West Wing slowly evolved into something much more complicated. According to later accounts, the two exchanged glances and small conversations before anything more happened, the kind of quiet, electric moments that, in hindsight, feel almost inevitable given what was about to unfold. It's worth remembering just how different the atmosphere inside the White House felt during those particular weeks. With so much of the regular staff sent home because of the funding standoff in Congress, the building took on an almost eerie, hollowed-out quality. Corridors that were usually bustling with aides and advisors suddenly quiet. Phones that normally rang constantly sitting silent for long stretches. For a young intern who idolized the presidency and everything it represented, being trusted with real responsibility during that strange, quiet period made the experience feel even more surreal, and it placed her, almost by accident, in close and repeated proximity to the most powerful man in the world. By November of that year, the relationship between the president and the young intern had crossed a line that would eventually cost him nearly everything. It was not a public affair, or even a widely suspected one at the time. It existed almost entirely behind closed doors, hidden within a busy, chaotic White House where everyone assumed the president's attention was consumed by matters of state. Lewinsky would later describe those early encounters as thrilling and disorienting all at once, the sense of being pulled into an orbit that very few people ever got close to. For nearly a year and a half, this secret continued, unnoticed by almost everyone around them, tucked into private moments in the president's study and other quiet corners of the White House complex. By December of 1995, Lewinsky had moved into a paying position within the Office of Legislative Affairs, a job that kept her close to the Oval Office and gave her regular reasons to deliver documents directly to the president. It was, in some ways, the perfect cover for a relationship that neither party wanted anyone else to know about. But covers like that rarely last forever, especially in a building filled with staffers who notice everything. And it wouldn't take long before someone did notice, setting off a chain of events that neither Clinton nor Lewinsky could have imagined at the time. A transfer, a warning, and a new friendship. By the spring of 1996, people around the White House had begun to take note of Lewinsky's frequent presence near the Oval Office, and not everyone was pleased about it. Evelyn Lieberman, the deputy chief of staff at the time, made the decision to transfer Lewinsky out of the White House altogether, moving her to a communications role at the Pentagon. The official explanation given was about behavior and professionalism concerns, though many close to the situation suspected there was more going on beneath the surface. Whatever the true reasoning, the transfer effectively pulled Lewinsky away from daily contact with the president, though it did not end whatever private connection remained between them. It was at the Pentagon that Lewinsky's life took another fateful turn. She was placed in an office alongside a woman named Linda Tripp, a career government employee who had worked in the White House herself during past administrations and had her own complicated history with the Clintons. Tripp was older, more experienced, and, at least outwardly, seemed like a trustworthy confidant for a young woman navigating an emotionally overwhelming secret. Over the following months, the two women grew close, and Lewinsky, isolated from the world she had just been pushed out of, began to open up about her relationship with the president. For Lewinsky, still only in her early 20s and suddenly cut off from the daily proximity to Clinton that had defined the previous months, Tripp became something like an anchor, an older, worldly friend who seemed to understand the strange, disorienting position she found herself in. Lewinsky would later describe those long conversations as a kind of emotional lifeline during an incredibly isolating period of her life, a place where she felt she could finally speak honestly about a relationship she couldn't discuss with almost anyone else in her orbit. It's a detail that makes what happened next feel even more devastating in hindsight, because the very friendship that felt like a refuge was quietly being turned into evidence. What Lewinsky did not know was that Tripp had her own motivations and connections, ones that stretched into conservative political and literary circles interested in exposing Clinton. Beginning in the fall of 1997, Tripp made a decision that would change the course of American political history. Without Lewinsky's knowledge, she began secretly recording their phone conversations, capturing hours of intimate, unguarded details about the affair, the president's behavior, and Lewinsky's feelings about the entire situation. These recordings would eventually become some of the most consequential pieces of evidence in the entire scandal. But at the time, Lewinsky had no idea her closest confidant was building a case against the man she believed she loved. Meanwhile, an entirely separate legal storm was already brewing, one that had nothing to do with Lewinsky at first, but would soon collide with her story in a way that made the entire scandal impossible to contain. The lawsuit that changed everything. Years before anyone had heard the name Monica Lewinsky, a woman named Paula Jones had filed a sexual harassment lawsuit against Clinton, alleging that he had made unwanted advances toward her back in 1991, while he was still governor of Arkansas. Jones had worked as a state employee at the time of the alleged incident, and she came forward publicly with her account years later, in 1994, shortly after Clinton had already settled into the presidency. Her lawsuit set off its own drawn-out legal battle, one that Clinton's legal team fought hard to delay, arguing that a sitting president shouldn't have to face civil litigation over conduct that predated his time in the White House. The case dragged through the courts for years, tangled in legal battles over whether a sitting president could even be sued while in office. Eventually, the Supreme Court ruled that the case could proceed, and Clinton's legal team found themselves preparing him to be deposed, something almost unheard of for a president. As part of building their case, Jones's lawyers wanted to establish a pattern of behavior, and somewhere along the way, they caught wind of rumors involving a White House intern. Through a strange and tangled set of connections, Linda Tripp's name eventually surfaced in relation to the Jones case, and in January of 1998, Tripp handed over her secret recordings of Lewinsky to lawyers connected with the investigation. Almost simultaneously, Tripp brought the tapes to the office of Kenneth Starr, the independent counsel who had already spent years investigating the Clintons over an entirely different matter, a real estate deal known as Whitewater. Starr had been circling the Clintons for years without landing a decisive blow, and the Lewinsky tapes gave his investigation an entirely new direction. Almost overnight, an inquiry that had started with land deals in Arkansas pivoted toward a much more personal and explosive subject: whether the president had lied under oath about a sexual relationship with a young White House intern. It was a pivot that would consume the country for the next year, and it all began with a single phone call and a stack of hidden audio tapes sitting in a woman's closet. On January 17th, 1998, Clinton was formally deposed in the Jones case. Under oath, he denied having had a sexual relationship with Lewinsky. It was a claim that would soon prove impossible to defend, but for the moment, it seemed like just another line in a long legal battle most Americans weren't even paying close attention to. That silence was about to end in dramatic fashion, and what happened next would make sure absolutely no one in the country could look away. The story breaks. On that very same day, a relatively obscure internet gossip outlet called The Drudge Report published a bombshell claim. According to the story, a major national magazine had prepared an explosive article about an alleged affair between President Clinton and a White House intern, but had decided at the last minute to hold the story back. Once Drudge published the claim, it was as if a dam had broken. Within days, the story exploded across every major news outlet in America, and the name Monica Lewinsky went from being completely unknown to being recognized in households across the country. The speed of it all was staggering, especially for an era just before social media as we know it today. Cable news channels ran wall-to-wall coverage. Newspapers scrambled to catch up with a story that had leaked outside the traditional gatekeepers of journalism. For many Americans watching at home, it felt disorienting. A sitting president, someone they had elected and, for many, come to respect, was suddenly at the center of allegations too strange and too personal to fully process. And through it all, the White House response was firm and consistent, an outright denial. If you were old enough to remember those weeks in early 1998, you probably recall just how inescapable the story became. It dominated morning shows and evening news broadcasts alike, spilled into late-night comedy monologues, and turned into the kind of thing co-workers whispered about around the coffee machine before quickly changing the subject when someone else walked by. News magazines that normally covered policy debates and international affairs suddenly found themselves printing cover after cover devoted to a 24-year-old woman most of the country had never heard of just days earlier. It was a strange collision of politics and tabloid culture, one that blurred lines that, until then, had felt fairly clearly drawn. Just days after the story broke, Clinton stood before the American people during a press event at the White House and delivered one of the most quoted lines in modern presidential history. He wagged his finger toward the cameras and firmly denied ever having had an improper relationship with that woman, referring to Lewinsky. It was a moment of raw political theater, delivered with total conviction, and for a while, it seemed to work. Many Americans, exhausted by years of political scandal and desperate to believe their president, wanted to take him at his word. But behind closed doors, the machinery of Kenneth Starr's investigation continued to grind forward, gathering testimony, subpoenaing witnesses, and slowly building a case that would eventually make that denial impossible to sustain. The country was about to learn just how far the investigation was willing to go, and just how much physical evidence existed that no denial could explain away. The evidence that could not be denied. For months, the investigation moved carefully and quietly, gathering testimony from White House staff, Secret Service agents, and anyone who might have witnessed something during Lewinsky's time working near the Oval Office. Investigators interviewed dozens of people who had crossed paths with Lewinsky during her time in the building, piecing together a timeline almost entirely from second-hand observation, since so much of what actually happened had occurred behind closed doors with no witnesses present at all. Lewinsky herself was granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for full cooperation, and in the summer of 1998, she appeared before the grand jury to give her account of the relationship in extensive detail. Her testimony filled in many of the gaps that had only existed as rumor and second-hand accounts up to that point. The negotiations leading up to that immunity deal were themselves tense and drawn out, with Lewinsky's legal team spending weeks going back and forth with Starr's office over the exact terms of her cooperation. For a young woman barely in her mid-20s, the pressure of facing a team of federal prosecutors, knowing that her own parents had also been threatened with legal jeopardy, must have been almost unimaginable. It was only after those terms were finally settled that she agreed to testify in full, providing prosecutors with the detailed account that would eventually form the backbone of the entire Starr report. But it was a single piece of physical evidence that made the entire case impossible to argue away. Lewinsky had kept an article of clothing, a navy blue dress, that contained biological evidence linking directly back to the president. Once investigators confirmed the DNA match, there was no longer any credible way to deny that a sexual relationship had taken place. It was an almost unbelievable turn in a story that had already felt larger than life, a small, unassuming piece of fabric becoming the piece of evidence that would finally force a president to admit the truth. On August 17, 1998, Clinton testified before the grand jury, becoming the first sitting president in American history to testify as a subject of a criminal investigation. His testimony was later broadcast to the public, an extraordinary and almost surreal moment, watching a sitting president answer painfully personal questions on camera. That same evening, he addressed the nation directly, finally admitting that he had, in fact, engaged in what he described as an inappropriate relationship with Lewinsky. He acknowledged misleading the country and his own family, though he stopped short of admitting he had lied under oath or orchestrated any effort to cover up the truth. It was a moment of reckoning, unlike anything the country had witnessed from a sitting president before. Watching the footage of a president being cross-examined so closely about his private life felt, to many viewers at the time, almost unprecedented in its rawness, a level of public exposure no previous commander-in-chief had ever endured while still in office. But rather than closing the chapter, it opened the door to an entirely new and far more serious phase of the crisis, one that would threaten to remove Clinton from office altogether. The Starr Report and the Road to Impeachment. Just weeks after Clinton's televised admission, Kenneth Starr delivered a massive, detailed report to Congress outlining the findings of his investigation. Released to the public in September of 1998, the Starr Report ran to hundreds of pages and included graphic, often uncomfortably explicit descriptions of the relationship between Clinton and Lewinsky, details that shocked even seasoned political observers who thought they had already heard everything. The report argued that Clinton had committed grounds for impeachment, including perjury, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power, built on his denials under oath and his efforts to conceal the relationship. The release of the report set off a political firestorm, unlike anything Washington had experienced since the Watergate scandal decades earlier. Newspapers debated whether to publish its most graphic sections. Television networks aired portions of Clinton's grand jury testimony video, allowing viewers at home to watch, in real time, a president being questioned about the most private details of his life. Public opinion during this period was surprisingly complicated. Even as disapproval of Clinton's personal conduct grew, his job approval ratings as president actually remained relatively strong, a strange split that would define the entire scandal from that point forward. Political analysts at the time struggled to make sense of that split, and in many ways historians are still discussing it decades later. Part of the explanation seemed to be the strength of the economy at the time, with unemployment low and markets performing well, leaving many Americans reluctant to punish a president over his personal conduct when the country itself felt like it was doing fine. Another part of it seemed to be simple fatigue, a sense among ordinary voters that Washington had spent an enormous amount of time and money chasing a story that, however embarrassing, didn't feel connected to their daily lives. Whatever the reasoning, that gap between personal disapproval and continued job approval became one of the most studied phenomena to come out of the entire affair. By October, the House of Representatives voted to open a formal impeachment inquiry, sending the matter to the Judiciary Committee for review. Over the following weeks, lawmakers debated the specific articles of impeachment, ultimately narrowing them down to charges centered on perjury before the grand jury and obstruction of justice. It was an extraordinarily rare moment in American history, only the second time a sitting president would face impeachment by the House of Representatives following Andrew Johnson more than a century earlier. On December 19th, 1998, after nearly 14 hours of tense and emotional debate, the House of Representatives voted to impeach President Clinton, approving 2 of the 4 proposed articles. It was a historic and deeply divisive moment for the country, one that stretched far beyond the walls of Washington and into homes and workplaces across America, where people argued fiercely over whether the president's personal failings warranted his removal from office. But impeachment by the House was only the beginning of the process, and the next chapter would unfold in a setting even more dramatic than the one before it, the floor of the United States Senate. The Senate trial. In January of 1999, the impeachment trial officially began in the United States Senate, presided over by Chief Justice William Rehnquist, exactly as the Constitution required. For only the second time in American history, senators sat as jurors in the trial of a sitting president, weighing evidence, testimony, and constitutional arguments about what actually qualified as an impeachable offense. The trial captivated the nation, filling television screens for weeks as senators, both Democrat and Republican, wrestled publicly with questions that went far beyond one man's personal conduct. The core legal debate hinged on a difficult and deeply contested question: whether Clinton's actions, however personally reckless or morally troubling, actually rose to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors as described in the Constitution. Republicans argued that lying under oath and attempting to obstruct a federal investigation struck at the very foundation of the justice system, regardless of the underlying subject matter. Democrats countered that impeachment was meant for grave abuses of presidential power, not personal misconduct in one's private life, however embarrassing or wrong it may have been. Throughout the trial, public opinion remained remarkably steady. Polls consistently showed that a majority of Americans opposed removing Clinton from office, even as they disapproved of his personal behavior. This unusual divide, between disapproval of the man and support for the president, became one of the defining and most puzzling features of the entire saga, and it played a significant role in shaping how senators ultimately approached their vote. Inside the Senate chamber, the proceedings carried a strange, almost ceremonial weight. Senators sitting silently at their desks for hours at a stretch, forbidden from speaking during much of the formal presentation of evidence, a stark contrast to the fiery debates most Americans associated with Congress. House prosecutors, acting as impeachment managers, laid out their case methodically over several days, while Clinton's defense team countered with equally methodical arguments about the legal definition of impeachable conduct. Behind the scenes, moderate senators from both parties held quiet conversations about where the votes would ultimately land, aware that history was watching and that the outcome would shape how future presidents and future scandals would be judged for generations to come. On February 12, 1999, the Senate delivered its verdict. Neither article of impeachment received the two-thirds majority required for conviction, and Clinton was acquitted on both charges, allowing him to remain in office and complete his term as president. It was a moment of enormous relief for the Clinton White House, but the scandal had already left permanent scars on his presidency, on his family, and on the way the country would remember his time in office. The story, though, was far from finished, because acquittal in the Senate did not mean the consequences simply disappeared. The personal and political fallout. Even after surviving the impeachment trial, Clinton faced a long list of consequences that stretched well beyond the walls of the Capitol. In April of 1999, a federal judge held him in civil contempt of court for giving misleading testimony in the earlier Paula Jones deposition, resulting in fines and, eventually, the temporary suspension of his law license in Arkansas. It was a quiet but significant reminder that legal consequences, even for a sitting and later former president, did not simply vanish once the political battle in the Senate had ended. On his very last full day in office, Clinton reached an agreement with independent counsel investigators, acknowledging he had given misleading testimony in exchange for an end to the possibility of criminal charges once he left the presidency, closing out the legal saga almost exactly as his term itself was ending. For Hillary Clinton, the scandal placed her in an almost impossible position, forced to navigate her marriage, her own political future, and the glare of a nation watching her every public appearance for signs of how she truly felt. She largely maintained public composure throughout the ordeal, standing beside her husband during his most difficult public moments, even as speculation about the true state of their marriage swirled endlessly in the press. Reporters and commentators dissected her every expression, every public statement, searching for hints of anger, forgiveness, or resignation. And the sheer intensity of that scrutiny added an entirely separate layer of pressure to an already overwhelming period in her life. In the years that followed, she went on to build her own remarkable political career, winning a seat in the United States Senate representing New York, later serving as Secretary of State, and eventually becoming a major party's presidential nominee herself. For Monica Lewinsky, the aftermath proved far more brutal and far more lonely. Unlike Clinton, who had the protections and resources of the presidency, Lewinsky found herself instantly transformed into one of the most publicly scrutinized and mocked young women in the world, her name and image endlessly reproduced in late-night comedy routines, tabloid headlines, and political cartoons. For years afterward, finding steady employment proved incredibly difficult, since most companies were wary of the attention that came attached to her name, and she has described feeling as though she was frozen in time, forever associated with a single chapter of her early 20s, no matter how much of her life continued to unfold afterward. She has spoken in later years about how deeply isolating and painful that period of her life became. describing herself as one of the earliest examples of a person almost entirely defined and humiliated by a single moment of exposure in the public eye, long before the internet as we know it today even fully existed. In the years since, she has worked to reclaim her own narrative, speaking openly about the toll public shaming takes on a person and becoming an advocate against online harassment and bullying. She has since built a career as a writer and public speaker, and has spoken candidly in interviews and public talks about walking through those years, feeling as though she carried the weight of the entire scandal almost entirely alone, while the president at the center of it continued on with his career largely intact. Linda Tripp, whose secret recordings had set the entire chain of events into motion, faced her own reckoning as well. Widely viewed by the public as a betrayer of a young friend's trust, she became one of the most reviled figures connected to the entire scandal, her name becoming, for many Americans, synonymous with disloyalty. She largely withdrew from public life in the years that followed, living with the weight of a decision that had reshaped not just her own life, but the direction of an entire presidency. In interviews given years later, Tripp maintained that she believed she had done the right thing, insisting she felt a duty to come forward with what she knew, though that explanation did little to soften how much of the public viewed her actions at the time and for years afterward. The legacy that followed him. When Clinton left office in January of 2001, his approval ratings remained surprisingly strong for a president who had endured impeachment, a testament to how sharply Americans separated their views on his job performance from their views on his personal conduct. He went on to build an active and, in many ways, respected post-presidency, launching a global charitable foundation, campaigning for his wife's political career, and remaining a prominent voice within his party for decades afterward. For a long stretch of years following his presidency, the scandal seemed to settle into something like a strange footnote, a chapter people remembered but rarely dwelled on for long, treated almost as a curious relic of a different political era, one that predated the constant churn of the internet news cycle. Clinton continued appearing at conventions, giving speeches, and remaining a respected elder statesman within his party, and for a while it seemed as though history might simply file the affair away as a colourful, if embarrassing, footnote in an otherwise consequential presidency. And yet, no matter how much time passed, the scandal never fully faded from how the world remembered him. Even decades later, in the era of movements like Me Too, which forced a broader cultural reckoning around power, consent, and workplace relationships, Clinton's conduct with a young intern was re-examined through an entirely new lens. Questions that once focused narrowly on perjury and obstruction of justice increasingly widened to include deeper concerns about the profound power imbalance between a sitting president and a 22-year-old intern. Concerns that Lewinsky herself has openly acknowledged and reflected on in interviews years later, describing the relationship as, in her words, a serious abuse of power rather than a simple consensual affair between equals. That shift in perspective marked a significant change in how the entire saga came to be understood by later generations. Where the coverage of the late 1990s often focused heavily on scrutinizing Lewinsky, her clothing, her personality, her private conversations, the more modern lens has increasingly turned that scrutiny back toward the imbalance of power at the very center of the relationship, asking harder questions about a young intern and a president who held the single most powerful position on Earth. Documentaries and retrospectives released in more recent years have revisited the entire saga with this new framing in mind, giving Lewinsky herself a platform to describe her own experience in her own words for the first time, after decades of having her story told largely by other people. The story of Bill Clinton's affair remains one of the most studied and dissected political scandals in American history, not simply because of what happened behind closed doors in the White House, but because of everything it revealed about power, privacy, media, and public forgiveness. It was a story that unfolded in real time in front of an entire nation, turning a young intern into a household name overnight, nearly ending a presidency, and leaving behind questions about accountability and power that are still being asked today. For those who lived through it, the memory tends to linger in strange, specific fragments: the sound of a television anchor breaking into regular programming, the sight of a president's finger wagging at a podium, the particular hush that fell over a room when the subject came up at dinner. For younger generations who only know the story secondhand, through documentaries, retrospectives, and half-remembered pop culture references, it can be difficult to fully grasp just how completely this single story consumed the country for the better part of 2 years, crowding out nearly every other headline and conversation across the nation. Decades later, people continue returning to this story, not just for the scandal itself, but for what it says about how quickly a reputation, once seemingly untouchable, can unravel in full public view, and about how differently each person at the center of it, the president, the intern, the friend who recorded the calls, the wife who stood beside him, would go on to carry the weight of those years for the rest of their lives. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.